Hi, my name is Sara Steimel, and I am the author of this metasynthesis. I have a background in science education, talented and gifted education, and teaching with 5 years' experience as a science teacher to students identified as talented and gifted. The problem that this metasynthesis seeks to understand is that minority students, specifically African American and Hispanic, have been underidentified and underrepresented in gifted education programs in the United States public education system. I selected this program due to my personal belief in an equal education for all students as a basic human right. Research shows that African American students in the United States are underrepresented by as much as 48% in comparison to their non-minority peers. This means that at least 250,000 African American students in the United States need gifted education services but are not receiving them. In addition, non-minority students are overrepresented in these programs. This is important to note because the percentage of minority students in public schools are predicted to increase in the future. There are 3 main methods for identification of students for gifted services. Students can be recommended by teachers based on their behavior and performance in class. This is called teacher referral. Another method of identification is utilizing standardized test scores. This type of identification requires students to exceed a cutoff score in order for recommendation. Lastly, many schools allow parents to request that their child be screened for gifted services. 2 primary theories that were identified throughout the literature. The first is racial identity theory. In this theory, the perception exists that black and white students are intellectually different simply based on their race. This perception is a belief that can be deeply rooted in peer groups. The second theory, deficit thinking theory, exposes the underlying causes of underidentification because it explains how lower expectations by teachers simply due to race exist. Minority groups are blamed for the underrepresentation as opposed to the systems that are in place that fail to identify them. Knowing the underlying struggles based on theory helps to form practical applications to increase the representation of minority students in gifted education. The issue of underrepresentation persists despite the research conducted on potential causes. Identification methods are still unsuccessful in accurately representing all student groups. The purpose of this study was to conduct a metasynthesis of previous research on the underrepresentation of minority students in gifted education. This metasynthesis aimed to answer the 2 following research questions. The 2 research questions for this metasynthesis are: what are the common themes found in previous research about the underrepresentation of minority students in gifted education in the United States? And what practical applications from research can be used to guide school districts in increasing the representation of minority students in gifted education? The common themes in question 1 will be utilized to help develop practical applications for school districts in question 2. The potential impacts of this metasynthesis can be found not only in my field of study but also in my personal line of work. Awareness needs to be made of the underrepresentation so that districts can be presented with practical applications that may assist in the increased identification of minority students. A qualitative metasynthesis was conducted utilizing existing literature to gain in-depth knowledge of the topic of study to pick up key ideas, themes, and categories. A search of literature was conducted between December of 2019 and April of 2020. By completing a systematic search of the Morningside Library database, peer-reviewed articles, journals, and books needed to be primary empirical research studies and less than 10 years old. The study needed to occur in the United States public school systems, grades K through 12, with an emphasis on African American and Hispanic minorities. A search utilizing the database was conducted by inserting search terms related to the underrepresentation of minority students in gifted programs. An initial search yielded 142 references. After a screening process, which eliminated studies for reasons like participant issues and location of study, 12 studies remained to include in this metasynthesis. An initial read-through of each of the 12 research articles was conducted. Then an assessment using the CASP checklist was made. The CASP checklist is a tool researchers use to ensure validity, gather summative results, and make a reflection on how the study can help communities. Next, each article was open-coded, producing a total of 70 codes. After the initial coding process, axial coding was conducted, which reduced the codes to include a total of 8 codes within 3 categories. 3 common themes were identified throughout the literature. The first is a need for teacher education on the traits of gifted learners and identification methods. The second is a need for culturally sensitive identification methods. And the third is a closer look into the traits of gifted learners, specifically culturally diverse gifted learners. It is clear from the literature that pre-service teachers enter into their professions with minimal education on the traits and needs of gifted learners, specifically diverse learners. They also receive little to no education on the identification methods utilized for entrance into these programs. Although pre-service teachers are required to take courses on exceptional children, much of that time is spent on the needs and traits of struggling learners. Typically, pre-service teachers spend less than 1 semester learning about gifted learners. Further, once entering their careers, minimal time is spent during professional development on the needs and traits of gifted learners. The lack of education on these topics poses a barrier for minority students in need of gifted education if they do not fit the stereotypical mold of the gifted learner. Furthermore, pre-service teachers receive very little information on the identification measures used to identify these students. Much of the identification process is left up to the talented and gifted department. With the abundance of topics to cover during professional development time and minimal time allotted, the topic of identification is often neglected and left to specialists in the field of gifted education. This leaves general education teachers left with uncertainty when they are asked for assistance with teacher referral. The second theme identified in the first research question were the most common identification methods. Teacher referral is the most common in the United States and asks educators to identify students in their classroom based on behavior and performance in class. With this method, teacher bias can be an issue due to lack of education on gifted and culturally diverse learners. Another commonly used identification method is the use of universal screening. Universal screening utilizes standardized test scores to screen all students for services. A cutoff score is used to identify the top performers who might benefit from services. Unfortunately, this can be a detriment to minority students due to persistent achievement gap. To account for this, some schools utilize local and group norming, where cutoff scores are adjusted to reflect averages in the region within certain groups of students. This has been shown to include students that may not have typically qualified to, but do so now. Lastly, nonverbal assessments can be used as a method of identification. Nonverbal assessments are useful in identifying non-academic traits, such as spatial and figural talents, as well as creativity and leadership, both of which are difficult or impossible to witness utilizing standardized testing. Nonverbal assessments can also be useful in identifying those students that may have language or cultural barriers. The last theme identified covered the traits of gifted learners. The literature shows that many pre-service and in-service teachers hold stereotypes of gifted learners, like being hard workers, being good at math, being quiet, and being attentive. However, this is far from the truth. Gifted students are extremely diverse. Because of these stereotypes, non-traditional gifts such as creativity and leadership skills often go unnoticed due to focus on academic strengths. In addition, many cultures value and consider certain traits as a sign of giftedness, where other cultures may see them as behavior problems. Not recognizing these culturally diverse traits of giftedness can pose a barrier to those who exhibit them. All the common themes presented in the first research question can work together to form practical applications for school districts to use to increase the representation of minority students in gifted education. This image shows how there is a need for gifted education, for teacher education on both identification methods and the traits of gifted learners in order to decrease the underrepresentation. In addition, suggestions for change in identification methods to a more culturally sensitive process can also be made. Both pre-service and in-service teacher education on the topics of gifted learners, culturally diverse learners, and identification methods are recommended as practical application districts can use to increase minority representation. Educating pre-service and in-service teachers on the traits and needs of gifted learners helps to eliminate stereotypes and decrease bias. Education on identification methods is also necessary to increase the accuracy of referrals. Colleges and school districts can increase teacher education of the above topics by dedicating more time on gifted learners in exceptional student courses, as well as conducting more frequent professional development in schools. The second practical application suggested is the use of identification matrix included in culturally sensitive identification methods. An identification methods uses multiple methods of identification in conjunction to measure both academic and social traits. It can include various things like universal screenings, group norms, and nonverbal assessments. It is important to include culturally sensitive identification methods within the matrix so as to accurately identify all students that are in need of gifted services. There is a clear need for change to increase the representation of minority students in gifted education. Teacher bias due to deficit thinking still persists due to the lack of teacher pre-service and in-service education on culturally diverse and gifted students. Identification methods are inadequate for the increasingly diverse communities in the United States. An underinformed community of educators on the topic of gifted learners only further makes popular identification methods like teacher referral inaccurate and not representative of the population of their students. Utilizing culturally sensitive identification matrix will help to recognize students that possess gifts and traits to receive gifted services to further support and excel their academic success. Utilizing practical applications suggested based on research analyzed would show an increase in representation of minority students. Teacher education on traits of culturally diverse learners is necessary to help recognize students who do not possess the stereotypical gifts and traits of gifted learners. Teachers also need to be educated on identification methods and requirements for gifted services so that they can more accurately identify them. The limitations of this study stem from a lack of access to classroom and teachers. Recommendation for future research would be to implement teacher education on gifted and culturally diverse learners as well as implementing a culturally sensitive identification matrix. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about this metasynthesis.